Hi, Michael. How are you?
Doing well, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing great. We live in the same city, and you didn't know that apparently until
Yes.
today.
I have a very bad. I'm sure we discussed it when we met, but totally forgot.
Well, just quickly for everybody, this is the Cafe B single serving because my co-host Rick Rose, and that's a story we won't get into. But it turns out that there's a connection between you and Rick that was quite
Hmm.
mind blowing, and so you're going to connect with Rick offline, which is wonderful. But
Yes.
these are YouTube. It's a YouTube podcast that Rick and I have been doing for a while, and we have a lot of fun with it.
Hmm.
And you're my guest tonight. You're our celebrity chef at the cafe,
Excellent.
but you actually are a poet. You're a lot of things. You're a teacher, and are you teach, right?
Well, I'm trying not to anymore, but I have a long academic and scholarly and teacherly past.
I noticed that in the about the author, and so everybody, this is your book. It's This Life Now, Michael Broder, Broder, and later I want you to tell everybody where they can get the book and about your website. But we met at the Rainbow Book Fair in March, which I had a really nice time. I also met another author named Vinton Rafe McCabe, who was on our Age to Perfection podcast a few
Yeah, I was
years
listening
ago.
to that the other day.
Really nice guy, and he had actually knew about the podcast, which kind of
That's exciting.
yeah, it made my day. It was a little weird, but it made me happy. And it's nice to get you back or to get you on here and see you again because you were so friendly. You were right across the way from me and Frank, my husband. And so let's get into this. I on your website, I saw that you refer to yourself as the oldest new voice in contemporary poetry. Now you've had poems published because I read that,
Yes.
but I'm curious to know um, why now with a book with a poetry book? Why so long?
Well, oldest new voice in contemporary poetry, which may or may not even really be true, but it sounds fun.
I like it.
And yeah, because this book, This Life Now, is a book that I was trying to get out there in the world starting around 2007. So, first of all, I didn't really start writing poetry until I was about 30,
Hmm.
um, which was about 20 plus years ago. And I kind of wrote as a child, as a 12, 14, 16, 18-year old. Um, but in a way that's kind of connected with my coming out story or my non coming out story, because what happened when I was about 18 years old and starting college was I realized that all I want to write is gay coming of age stories, and yet I don't want to write gay coming of age stories because I wasn't out in 1979 and I really didn't want to be. So, what was my solution? I just stopped writing. Just kind of a dumb solution, but that's how I felt.
Hmm.
So then, about 10 years later, I was out, life was moving on, and suddenly I sort of started feeling like I wanted to write fiction again. So we're talking about around 1988 or 80 or so. And I start writing stories and writing stories and writing stories, and they tend to be the same gay coming of age stories that I was writing when I was, 16 or 18 years old and never really wrote.
Hmm.
Um, and after a while, I began to feel that I was telling lies, which is very unfair to fiction and to fiction writing and to fiction writers. But I began to feel that stories I were telling were just stories I was telling, and that I had this urge to say something more direct and to somehow speak more directly. And I began writing in a different way, and I would think, is this a poem? Because I don't really know what a poem is, I mean, I've read poems all my life, but I've never really read about poetry or what makes a poem or how you write poems. But gradually I realized that what I was writing was poems. So we're talking now, it's 1990, 1991, the early 90s. I'm starting to write poetry. I'm in my early 30s already. And this goes on for a number of years, and I have no idea what to do with them. And I'm just writing and writing and writing. And then gradually, I mean, really into the mid 90s, taking some workshops, into the late 90s, meeting my to be husband, Jason Schneiderman, poet,
Hmm.
author of Sublimation Point and Striking Surface. He came to New York to go to NYU for the MFA program. And I kind of like thought, oh, so that's what you can do. You can get an MFA. So I kind of followed in his footsteps and did that in the early 2000s again. So now I'm in my early 40s. And by the time that's over, I decide I want to finish my long unfinished PhD. And so around 2005, I start doing that. Here I'm now 44 years old. Meanwhile, I put together this manuscript and start submitting it to contests, which is how a lot of poetry books get into the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't really working. Didn't go anywhere. Didn't get honorable mention for 2 years, nothing. And at a certain point, I just thought, I need to finish this dissertation. I need to start focusing on whether I'm going to have an academic career or not. And just kind of shelved the poetry book. So the poems in this book, This Life Now, kind of were written anywhere between like 1995 and 2005. And the whole manuscript came together around 2007. But then by 2009, I just kind of like put it in a drawer and didn't do anything with it anymore. Was finishing my PhD, doing academic writing, having academic jobs, being on the academic job market. And that was kind of that. And then about a year ago at Rainbow Book Fair in 2013, Jason and I, my husband Jason and I were there together. We passed by the table, like the one I was staffing in March, of A Midsummer Night's Press, where a wonderful lesbian feminist poet, essayist, and scholar named Julie Enzer, who's with Sinister Wisdom, a venerable lesbian feminist journal and press. And she personally works alongside my publisher, Lawrence Schimmel, at A Midsummer Night's Press, and they've developed a series called Sapphic Classics. But for kind of bringing back into print lesbian classics by people like Minnie Bruce Pratt and Cheryl Clark that may be hard to find now. But anyway, Julie said, Michael, I was talking to Lawrence Schimmel, A Midsummer Night's Press, my publisher, just a little while ago about the 2014 list, and your name came up. So I strongly suggest you send him a manuscript. And I sent him the manuscript, and within, by March of this year, we had this book, from which he kind of culled all the poems that were more, since his imprint, Body Language is the name of the series within his press, and Midsummer Night's Press. The Body Language books are all about sort of gay experience, gay relationships, and so forth. So he kind of cut anything out of the manuscript that was about 9/11 or Iraq or Afghanistan or my mother's illness and death or, various other kinds of poems, because I was trying to be not just a gay poet. Mm-hmm. And he took all that stuff out of it, and he came together with a short but really powerful manuscript about gay relationships, gay experience, and centrally my living with HIV during the 1990s. And that's what this book is. That's kind of how and why it took so long to come into the world, and why I think I'm the oldest new voice in contemporary poetry.
So what kind of time span does this book cover?
So there's the middle section is called Portrait of the Artist as a Young Sodomite, and kind of has like poems that go back to, there's a poem in the book called Imaginary Playmate, about that sort of fantasy superhero playmate that I had when I was like 5. So we're talking about a book that kind of spans memories of childhood in the 1960s and kind of awkward adolescence in the 1970s, and first forays into kind of gay experience in the 1980s, and then kind of has another section that's all about the 90s and it's called My First 10 Plague Years, about living with HIV in the 90s. And then the last section, which is called This Life Now, is kind of like, and I survived the 90s. I met the love of my life. We got married in Massachusetts in 2004, and now it's a new world. So the poems in the book kind of span anywhere from like the 60s and 70s to more or less contemporary times around the mid 2000s.
I was going to ask you, to read a couple of them. Can you do that?
Yeah, so we talked about possibly my reading Words and Things, I think.
Words and Things and Mod Squad.
Yeah, so Words and Things actually started out as other poems than what it is now. So that's kind of it. So I realized that my forte is the poem addressed to you, to the boy that I loved, to the boy that I lost. This actually was kind of like philosophy poems about like language and how language works, and it was like, something's not working with these poems. What if I take them and I sneakily put them into a poem that's addressed to a boyfriend?
Mm-hmm.
And this was the result. So Words and Things, in other words, when I say poems about language, Les mots et les choses is one of the great sort of post-structuralist philosophical works of Michel Foucault, for example.
Now, just briefly, have you read Foucault?
Somewhat. What I've mostly read is Volume 1 of History of Sexuality, which kind of figures into my doctoral dissertation.
I'm only asking because it's really dense stuff.
Yeah.
It's not light summer reading.
I don't think I read Les mots et les choses, or Words and Things. But in any case, here's the poem. It's called Words and Things. Near the end, we walked along the beach. You said we felt disconnected, like a sentence with no conjunctions. Once we had shared razors, toothbrush, a blanket. Like sea and air share the horizon, reflecting, penetrating each other, each better suited to any given thing, like air to birds, sea to fish, yet both hospitable to rainstorms, and each with something unique to offer sunsets. Near the end, we talked about words, how actions speak louder but are generally inadequate to hypotheses and other logical or affective relations whose truth or validity are only apparent over time, as in the pen is mightier than the sword, or the phrase killing with kindness.
Do you do readings?
I do. I just, the last reading that I did was so much fun. It was at CCNY, City College, up on 138th Street in Manhattan or whatever, for the class, sort of an LGBT lit class. The professor was a gentleman whom some of your followers may know, named Brandon Judell. And I read for his students, along with Julie Enzer, whom I mentioned earlier, and David Groff. Maybe some of your readers or viewers will know him as well, a gay poet whose most recent book of poems is called Clay, and who also teaches at CCNY, as a matter of fact. And the students really connected with me and my work, which was a lot of fun, these 18, 20, 22-year-olds. And out of that experience came the suggestion from Julie that I work on a memoir, because as I would read each poem to the students, and it would be about this deceased lover or that deceased lover or this experience of HIV or this aspect of gay coming of age, I would kind of tell them the backstory a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
And as we were going to the subway after the reading, Julie was saying, the way you told your stories about different boyfriends and different experiences, you should be writing a memoir. And now I'm really now I'm devastated, because it's I don't want to remember. I want to work on my poetry. Now I have to write a memoir, because Julie said.
When you do a reading, do they ask questions?
Well, we had some Q&A at this particular reading, because it was a classroom-type setting. Generally, readings are not structured like that, but sometimes they are. It depends on the situation.
Yeah.
Are there questions you're thinking of?
No, I'm asking because the only readings I've done are for my mystery books, and I really like doing it, and it's always fun, because those are pretty much that kind of reading. You read excerpts from your book, and then people ask questions, and it was really fun. I really
like when you go reading at a Barnes and Noble or something, or a bookstore. Yeah.
I read at Rainbow Mountain, which is a gay resort where we're going for Memorial Day weekend. I love that place, and it was the inspiration for my first mystery, because I said this would be a really great place to set a murder mystery. And then I read at Sage. That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
But I didn't know what I mean. I don't know when the last time I was at a poetry reading was maybe 10 years ago. Very long time. So.
Yeah, there's sometimes a bit of a wall between the poetry world and the fiction world.
And then I also asked if you would read Mod Squad. And
sure.
Because and then I'll tell you why when it's
okay.
over. But.
So I'm not quite sure. I guess I know how it made it in here, because it's part of the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Sodomite section. And it's appearing, first of all, I think it's been published, and maybe not. Yeah, it was previously published in a journal, and it's going to appear, I kind of need to say this, in an anthology called Rabbit Ears, which is TV poems. All the poems are about different TV shows, and edited by a gentleman named Joel Allegretti and is forthcoming on Poets Wear Prada, a small poetry press. And there's an edit in here that's not in the version that you're familiar with. Mod Squad.
Okay.
Mod Squad. I didn't leave home. I was kicked out. Pete says to Link as they drive conversing in close-ups through the LA night. I had the hots for Pete, and for Wally Cleaver, and for Chip, the middle of Fred McMurray's three sons, but never for any of the Brady boys, although possibly for the original youngest son, Chris, on the Partridge Family, the dark-haired one with the big brown eyes, Jeremy Geldwax, not that blonde dork Brian Forster who replaced him in season 2. Yes, Jeremy Geldwax was prepubescent, but so was I, so there was nothing icky about it. A little later, I had the hots for Douglas Abrams, but that was real life, not TV. Doug had light brown flyaway hair, the kind of hair boys would flick out of their eyes with a jerk of their neck in kind of a girlish way, and soft pink lips and the slightest bit of an overbite, and he was troublemaker enough to be bad boy sexy, but not so much as to trigger my withering sense of right and wrong. Except that to have the hots for him was wrong, but that's a different story, and we were pubescent by then.
I like that one. I mean, I liked all your poems, and there was a melancholy for me to a lot of them, especially in the first section. But that one struck me because I had crushes on TV people
Of course.
too. Mine were all men, though. I can't think of a think of a young, and I was maybe, I don't know, 11, 12 or something like that. But Bill Bixby and Robert Conrad from Wild Wild West. I know there were a couple of others, and then the odd one that I never really understood, and it just does. I really had a crush on Elizabeth Montgomery in Bewitched.
Well, I was going to say, although this is a little different than Elizabeth Montgomery in terms of like gay men or boys having crushes on women, but you mentioned Bill Bixby. I don't know if you mean like Lou Ferrigno, Bill Bixby, like whether you mean
Courtship of Eddie's Father.
Eddie's father, right? Because we're like in the same age group. So who did I have a crush on in Courtship of Eddie's Father?
The woman,
Christy McNichol.
Oh, was she in that?
But oh no, not Christy McNichol. I'm sorry, that's It Is Enough. No, Jodie Foster. So Jodie Foster was the girl upstairs or downstairs or wherever she was, who used to like punch little Eddie on the shoulder, on the arm, and like she was a tomboy friend.
Wow,
I had such a crush on Jodie Foster in Courtship of Eddie's Father and in Christy McNichol on, I think it was was it Eight Is Enough, or was one of those other family shows from like the mid 70s. So that was weird. So when I would have crushes on girls, they would be tomboys or lesbians. And and then you mentioned the men versus boys. So that's the funny thing about me and my whole trajectory as a gay man, is that when I was younger, when I was little, as I mentioned in the poem Imaginary, I mean, I should probably read that poem Imaginary Playmate by this point because I'm mentioning it so many times. I had crushes on like teenage boys when I was like 5 or 8 or 10 or 12. But the funny thing is, I kind of always stayed that way. So as I became older, I still kind of liked younger guys, and we're not going to get into issues of like of age or not of age, but just as a purely aesthetic issue, I always liked younger guys, and I kind of still do. My husband is 15 years younger than me. And but that was weird how I started out. These guys who were of a certain age, they were older than me in my imagination and in my fantasy life, and then they kind of stayed the same age, and I just got older. And then I liked younger guys. This was kind of weird. But yeah, I always kind of liked the older brother, on the TV show or whatever, the teenage brother. Weird.
Well, I was always attracted to older men. My partner, Jim, who died in 1991, he was 13 years older than me, and I moved to New York with my friend Michael, who we're still friends. Mm-hmm. He was 18 years older than me. But then something happened for me. I became the older man. When I hit 40, I started looking at people the age attraction was getting closer and closer.
Right.
Frank is just a year older than me.
Mm-hmm.
So
it happens. And then in my situation, 10 or 15 years younger than me, of course, continues to be older. Like
Yeah, well, that's
Now that
true.
I'm
Yeah.
53, 10 years younger than me is already 43, so it's not like
Yeah.
they're kids anymore.
So why don't you read Imaginary Friend?
Imaginary Playmate. Okay,
Imaginary Playmate.
yeah, no, that's also in the Portrait of the Artist as a Young Son. I just like saying Portrait of the Artist as a Young Son
Yeah.
as
Yeah.
many times as I can. Um, so Imaginary Playmate. I'm sorry, the ice cream truck is going outside. Imaginary Playmate. My parents questioned me, suspecting you existed. I affirmed you in a general way, but kept the intimate details to myself. How, clad in black trunks but otherwise bare, you rescued me from some always vague danger, swept me from the ledge of a high building, cradled me trembling in the crook of your arms, and flew away with me, my hand resting on the curve of your chest, my hot tears falling on your pink nipple.
I like that. And I had imaginary playmates too.
Dreamy fantasy life for like a 5-year-old boy, right?
Well, for me too, I knew that I was same-sex attracted. That's how I always say it because when I was 7 or 8 years old, gay is to me is almost a political identity. So I certainly was not gay.
Right.
People can take issue with that, but I don't consider myself as having been gay at 8 years old. But I was sex attracted. I knew from, whatever. As soon as I was sexually aware that I was attracted to males, and then of course I grew up and it became gayness.
Yeah.
But that was, and I also, for me, life was not really pleasant when I was a kid. I was adopted, and my father was a prick, and of course I was a gay kid in Indiana, and I was never in the closet. I always knew what I was, and the conflict for me was knowing that I lived in a hostile culture, that I lived in a society that did not approve of me, but I knew who and what I was. And I think that's a big part of why I became a writer. I started writing very, very young, writing speaking of imaginary playmates, I started out writing stories about this stuffed dog that I had, big St. Bernard stuffed animal. And I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years old. That's when I started writing. And poetry played a big part in my writing because I wrote for about 10 years, starting in high school with the suicide poet, the confessional poets everybody knows, Sylvia Plath and Anne Sexton, but also Nikki Giovanni, a bunch of others. But for 10 years, all I did was write poems in spiral notebooks, and that's all I wrote for a decade. And what I got out of that was a voice. Now, if you read my mysteries, you're going to say he's full of shit. What's he talking about?
Right.
But mysteries, light sort of mysteries, it's a different thing. It's it's a niche thing. But for the longest time, I wrote literary fiction that nobody bought, nobody read, nobody bought. And it's one reason I said, I'm going to write something really fun that people are going to buy. It wasn't hackdom, I don't think. I really love writing these books, but I also know what they are. But at the same time, I have a lot of literary fiction that I've written. And the poetry that I wrote is what gave me my, how to work with words and the sounds of the words in my head. So I couldn't, value poetry any more than I do. I just don't write it anymore. I stopped writing it a long time ago. I wrote plays for 10 years, had a bunch of those produced. The last one was at New Jersey Rep 12 years ago. And then I said, I'm going to go back to my first love. I just want to write fiction. I don't want to collaborate. I don't want to, get an artistic director's approval and then sit around with a bunch of actors and they all have their own opinions. And it's just me and a computer. And I really, really like that.
Yeah.
It works for me.
You kind of want to write what you want to write. And
especially now, it's like the dreams I had at 25 have I've gotten a lot more realistic about them. I'm not going to be Tony Kushner. It's not going to happen. I'm not going to be even now the gay literary writers. I know they're fabulous writers, but I'm not them. I don't want to be that. I just want to write whatever I want to write and have a good time doing it. Self-publish it and go on because I'm 56. I saw you were born in 1961, and I said,
Yeah.
"Fuck, I'm older than like everybody now."
Um, just barely.
N-
Yeah. Something that you said a moment ago, about being older, right? So I know this is a. I'm not sure if your LGBT senior audience somehow finds its way to these podcasts and
Well,
videos.
I'm going to put this on the website.
Okay, but I find that to be a really interesting issue, problem, phenomenon where you said, you're a certain age and you're realistic about what you're going to, the opportunities that you have or not, and some of that is based on time and age. And I find that younger people, I'm often around younger people, like because I went back and finished my PhD when I was in my mid to late 40s, and all the grad students I was getting friendly with were in their sort of mid to late 20s. They get so frustrated with me when I start to refer to choices that I've made that have something to do with my age, which I consider just being realistic.
Mm-hmm.
Like that I'm not going to pursue an academic career. My field is classics. It's a small field. I would have to kind of be willing to take one-year jobs all around the country for God knows how long before I might get a tenure track job. And that might have been fine when I was 30, but at 53 with a husband and a home and a bunch of kitty cats and so on and so forth, I'm not interested in that. And I say, at this stage of my life, and younger people will say, like, don't make it about age. You can do anything you want at any time. And I'll say, like, I know, I understand what you're saying. You don't really get what I'm saying. It's not that I feel that I couldn't do it. It's that I don't want to spend the next 10 years doing 10 one-year jobs in 10 different cities between the ages of 50 and 60. I don't want that for this part of my life.
Right. And it's, for some reason, I'm just very conscious of time now. But to me, I read somewhere a long time ago that time is a non-renewable resource. And I loved it when I read it, and it's been with me ever since then. It is non-renewable. I can't get it back. And I'm going to be 56. What do I want to do for, say, the next 10 years? And what do I not want to do?
Yeah.
And, trying to... It's exactly the same thing. I don't want to take up time with it, but I'm just aware every day now that I've got a limited amount of time, and I need to decide how I'm going to spend it. I need to decide what I want to write, what I don't want to write. Do I want to send out a bunch of short stories to magazines and get rejection slips and maybe place one, or spend time with an editor who says, I like it, but you should change this and that. I'm not going to do that anymore.
Right.
I don't want to. I'm not interested. 10 years ago, 20 years ago, sure. I'm not interested anymore. So I do my own thing because it goes back to that. It's not maudlin. I hear people who sort of rail against aging and, fight it, and it's all in your attitude. I can't stand it when people say you're only as old as you feel. That's bullshit. I'm 56.
No matter how I feel,
it has nothing to do with with my emotional state. I'm 56 years old.
Right.
Maybe I've got another, 20, 25 years in me, and I'm going to use it the way I want to use it.
Exactly.
Now, we are at the 28-minute mark, so
Okay.
we're going to close this, but we could talk forever. I'd love to have you on again if you would do that, because I know you're going to connect with Rick.
Yes.
And by the way, he's a lot of fun on a podcast. He's a lot of fun.
I looked at some of those podcasts, and he also changed his look from 1 to 18. I was kind of interested in that. He lost the glasses, lightened his hair.
And he's not going to like me telling you this, especially publicly, but he tends to he's 5 years younger than me, but he tends to end up with younger
I could imagine
boyfriends. He's got a lovely friend in his life now, Jesse, who's out, I think is with him for several weeks. But Rick, as I got older, the men I liked got sort of toward my own age. Rick has always liked a younger companion, and I gotta hope he's not pissed at me for saying that.
We'll have to have a show. We'll have to do a talk about that, about age and relationships.
Yeah, I like Frank. We got married in August. We've been together for 7 years, and I couldn't be happier. I love being married. We waited. We waited for a number of reasons. I think he had cold feet, but it was like, I'm not getting married until I can get married in New York State. Okay, fine. So then it passes in New York State, and then it was, I'm not going to get married until the federal government recognizes it, because what's the point? And then the Supreme Court overturned DOMA, basically.
Yeah.
And that you can't move the post anymore. That's
Yeah.
So we got married, and I think he really loves being married too. For me, and now you've been married for 10 years, but for me, it did feel different. And I could go on so long. I used to be, 10 years ago, 15 years ago, I was one of those, I don't like the word queer, but I was much more queer in my thinking, and I thought marriage was bourgeois,
right,
and it's about property rights, but then a lesbian at the church that I go to, her partner died in 9/11, died in one of the towers, and the partner's family kicked her out of the apartment and took the apartment, and that was when I started saying there's a lot more to this than being hetero, whatever. It's not about that for me.
It's true.
It was about making sure that we're protected. But on the other hand, too, I feel like we've taken our relationship as, to that level. We're married now. There's nowhere else to go other than to enjoy our lives together for, forever. Not forever. You know what I mean?
For your forever. I actually published a letter in the New York Times back in 2004, the bottom line of which was, I want Jason to get my Social Security check when I die. And that was how I was viewing the issue of marriage. And that's really more about DOMA and so forth, but still, that it is about property and so forth, but to some extent those things are important. Because
they're very important.
Yeah.
Because families, not ours, and, if they happen to see this, I'm not talking about you, but there are some fucked up families out there. I mean, really fucked up. And, boy, if you can protect yourself, please consider it. Now, tell people where they can get your book, and also what the address of your website is.
Okay, so my website is mbroder.com, first initial broder.com. www.mbroder.com, where you can find out all sorts of interesting things about me and my life and my book and my other publications. But actually, to get the book, you can go to a place like Amazon if you want, but you can also go to the Midsummer Night's Press website, which is simply Midsummer Night's Press, no apostrophe in the Midsummer Night's Press.com. And there's a titles section, so you can find my book there and order right from that page, and then see a Midsummer Night's Press's other titles that you might be interested in, lesbian and gay poets. And then there's also a whole other imprint that, get this, is poems about science fiction and fantasy. And sometimes there's an overlap between the science fiction and fantasy and the gay poets. But so there's a lot of stuff there to interest various people.
Okay. It's been great where in the city are you, by the way?
I'm in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn, where it's all happening.
Okay. Yeah. And that is the city. That's one thing that happened for me with 9/11 was that it sort of turned it into one big city, which was nice because Manhattanites have this attitude about the boroughs. And
that's how I grew up. I mean, I did grow up in Brooklyn, and now Brooklyn is where it's at.
I lived in Queens for 8 years, and I loved it. Astoria, I loved it. Okay, I'm going to sign us off here, but it's been really great to have you on. You're such a good energy, a fabulous poet.
Thank you.
And I'm really glad we met, and we will have coffee or lunch or something soon.
We will. Okay, talk to you soon. Bye.
Okay, good night.
Good night.